In this video, I will show you how I made this skeleton arm out of a pool noodle. For this, you will need a pool noodle, a rod. I used a metal one since I had it handy, but you can also use a wooden dowel rod, a box cutter, some long nose pliers, needle nose pliers, scissors, hobby knife, wire, and some electrical tape. You will need to cut 5 pieces of wires for the fingers around 8 inches each. These can be trimmed to the desired length a bit later. I will be making the bones in the arm, which is the humerus, the forearm, which is the radius and the ulna, and the hand, which is a lot of bones. The humerus is pretty straightforward. I cut a 13.5-inch piece of pool noodle and shaped both ends. To shape the ends, you will need to divide the top and bottom into 4. Start by cutting out a V on all sides, then curve the inside at an angle pointing towards the center. Curve each side of the 4 pieces to make it look more of a dome shape. And finally, round off the outsides to remove the harsh edges. It should look something like this. Next, the forearm. I cut a 9.5-inch piece of pool noodle and rounded off the edges. I also cut a pointed oval hole on the top and the bottom to make the radius and the ulna a separate thing. I wrapped the electrical tape on one part of this bone to round it out. I will tape up the second part when I attach it to the metal rod. For the wrist, I cut a 3-inch piece and cut it in half before shaping it to be wider on the top. The fingers will be the most difficult part of this project since it will need a lot of little pieces to put together. It is easier to cut a long 6.5 piece of pool noodle before dividing it vertically into 5 pieces. You will need 4 pieces for each finger and 3 pieces for the thumb. Once I cut out all the pieces for the fingers, I used the electrical tape to round them out. Leave a bit of space on the ends and use the scissors to trim the edges into a ball. Do this for all the pieces except the tip. Use your finger as a reference to shape the last piece. I used the long nose pliers to hold the wire while I pushed each foam piece into it. Be sure to keep the order of the size and not go through the tip of the finger. Also, while pushing the foam into the wire, try to keep the pieces centered. You can bend the fingers the shape that you want at this point. Next, you will attach all of the fingers onto the wrist. To do this, I bent the wire into a U shape. I made sure they were facing the right way before I secured them by pinching the ends of the curved wire onto itself. This will give you a greater range of motion to pose the hand, as opposed to just stabbing and gluing a straight wire into the wrist. To secure it better, I cut a small piece of wire and looped it in between each of the holes on the wrist and pinched the ends. With the hand finished, I trimmed the wrist smaller, leaving space between the edge and the wires. Once I saw the finished hand, I realized I wanted the pinky to be a bit shorter. So I trimmed the bottom bone by cutting a piece out of the middle before taping the pieces back together. Then I reassembled it. If you are satisfied with the length of the fingers, you can glue the end onto the wires. I used Craftology silicone glue since I had it on hand, but hot glue can work. Just be careful not to melt the foam with the glue, or else you'll have to remake it. I measured how much of the rod was needed to be able to attach the hand. I marked it with a Sharpie, and I also marked where the forearm started. To secure the forearm to the rod without glue, I wrapped electrical tape around both the rod and the foam to round it out. This process is a lot easier if you cut short strips of tape to wrap around instead of long ones. Be sure to wrap one last strip around both ends so the radius and ulna are not too far apart. It should end up looking something like this. Next, I attached the humerus to the rod by wrapping the electrical tape around it while it was in place, leaving a bit at the ends. I used a bit of force to wrap the tape tight enough so it ends up looking more bone-shaped. It would look something like this. Since my plan for this arm was to attach it to a coat rack and make it look like it was holding a lantern, I needed to make a hook to go in between the forearm and the hand. For the hook, I cut a long piece of wire and folded it in half, pinched the end, and while holding the wire with the long nose pliers, I twisted the wires together with a needle nose pliers. Bend the curved end into a U shape and wrap it around the pole in between the forearm and where the hand will be. Secure it with tape. Once the hook is secure, all that is left is attaching the hand to the end with the tape. And that is the arm complete. Now it just needs a couple of coats of paint before sealing it with some varnish. I used a combination of gesso and white spray paint since the pool noodle shouldn't melt. I have the fingers curled since I wanted it to look like it was holding a lantern, but with how they were put together, it has multiple ways that it could look. You can make as many as you want and customize them to fit your needs.